Hi, my name is Brian Turrisi. I'm one of the COPA University Platinum instructors and here today to talk about a new topic. All of us have various uses for our avionics, and there are many different avionics platforms, and many of us are into the Garmin G1000 platform. Today I'm going to be talking to you about one particular feature of these avionics that we don't use very often. It's the OBS and Suspend function. Many of you don't even know what that function is all about, particularly if you learned to fly in the days after GPS was invented. OBS in the old days was a turning knob that was used on a particular VOR type of navigation that we used to get from point A to point B by using a particular course. Since the age of GPS, we don't use VORs anymore, but as a result of that, we still have these buttons and functions available to us, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking to you about how they work. First of all, I'm going to show you a picture of where that button typically is in your avionics. If you notice here on the bottom of your PFD, there's a button labeled OBS. What does that stand for? The original definition was Omni Bearing Selector, but in today's world, in the world of GPS, what this does is it turns any waypoint in your flight plan into the equivalent of a VOR. By that I mean you can now use a waypoint to set a 360-degree course of your choice to any direction you want to go. By pushing that button, it turns even an airport into the equivalent of a navigation point where you can navigate to or from that particular area. Where would we use this? One of the most common places where we'll use it is when air traffic control issues you an instruction to fly a VOR radial out to a specific distance. We don't get this a whole lot anymore, but in certain parts of the country, air traffic controllers are still having us fly VOR waypoints and particular airways. You no longer have to go into your VOR function of your avionics at all to do this. In fact, our avionics are designed that you don't need a VOR in your airplane at all to be able to fly these particular type of airways. What you do instead is use OBS function. And I'm going to give you a specific example. Let's suppose you were given this instruction to fly on the 001 degree radial off the Savannah VOR to 20 plus miles and then proceed on course. The way that would look is something like this. If you look at my second picture over here, you would hit that OBS knob, and then there is another knob on your avionics platform called the course knob that we normally don't use at all. You would choose the waypoint that you want to use, which in this case would be the Savannah VOR, and then you would dial in the course of 001. And that would look like this on your particular map. As you can see, there is now a line that leads to the Savannah VOR both in and out of the VOR. And the 001 degree radial is depicted there as the white line. Why a white line? Because in our typical GPS terminology, magenta or pink lines always lead to a waypoint. We very rarely fly from a waypoint in GPS because our particular architecture of flight plans is to fly to a waypoint, then fly to the next waypoint, and to the next waypoint after that, and so on. In this particular case, OBS uses only one waypoint and gives us the option to fly either to or from that waypoint. In our example today, the controller told us to fly from Savannah out to 20 miles. So we would be flying out that particular white line, and there it is, and that would take us out to the appropriate distance, and then we would proceed on course. That's one common area where you'd be using OBS. The other popular area that some people have used relatively often is at their own airport, or more importantly, at an airport where they've never been before, where there is no visual approach and somebody's trying to find the most effective way to lock in on the final approach course to the runway. In that case, what you can simply do is use the airport in OBS mode and choose the course line that lines up with the final approach course to the runway. So for example, if we're dealing with runway 21 at a particular airport, you could use that airport, put it in OBS mode, then set the 21 degree course to that particular place. And it would look something like this. If we're using Hilton Head Airport now, as a guidance to that. And now we're going to the airport, so the magenta line is leading us right down the final approach path to the runway. This is not a perfect way to do this, because in reality what we're really doing is setting a course to the geographical center of the airport. And as you can see from the next picture, it doesn't quite line up with the final approach course, which is that dotted line on there, but it usually gets us close enough. And as a result of that, it's a nice way to find the extended center line of an airport. And so those are just two of the more common examples of how OBS really works. There are other examples too, but surprisingly, nobody anymore in this day and age with our GPS technology needs to use VOR technology at all, because all of the VORs are located in our GPS navigation database, and so an OBS function is a nice way to fly them, particularly if we're only told to fly a particular course outbound. There's a whole other function if we're going to load airways off of VORs and so on. That's a different topic. Now, the other thing I lumped into this discussion with OBS is another feature called Suspend, or SUSP. This has created a large degree of controversy because in our original Garmin navigators, and even to this day, the Suspend button is co-located with the OBS button. And so I showed you before where the OBS button is located, but now if you look at that same spot on your screen, you will see that there is no OBS button anymore. It has switched to Suspend. What is this really all about? This can become quite a complicated subject, but I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. First of all, Garmin is the only avionics platform that uses Suspend at all. OBS is available in Avidyne platforms and in other types of avionics platforms because it serves the same function for all of those. But Suspend is a feature that Garmin had to invent 30 years ago to stop the waypoint sequencing, particularly on an instrument approach, because when you reach the final approach, missed approach segment, which is usually the runway at an airport, the navigator did not know if you were going to land the airplane or fly the missed approach. And oftentimes if you were going to fly a missed approach, there was not a direct straight line from that missed approach point to the missed approach point. So they invented this thing called Suspend, which basically stands for suspending waypoint sequencing. What that really means is you will not automatically be sent to the next waypoint until you do something to tell it to do so. So where do we see this? Suspend shows up in a couple of different areas that you will find quite common if you fly a lot of instrument approaches as an instrument-rated pilot. The most common place it shows up is when you reach that missed approach point of what I just mentioned a minute ago. At that point, that OBS button that is on your navigator will automatically switch to Suspend. And then it is your job manually to decide whether you're going to activate the missed approach segment, and if you do, you have to manually unsuspend the Suspend button. That's where it gets complicated. In the more modern navigators, such as what we have in Cirrus aircraft, we now have what's called a toga button on our throttle, which stands for take off and go around. The toga button is what you push when you're going to start to fly a missed approach. And one of the features of the toga button is that it automatically takes you out of Suspend. It starts the sequence to the missed approach point. In the old days, when the navigator was not capable of defining altitudes, it couldn't work that way, because until we developed the capability of recognizing altitudes, when you pushed the Suspend button, it automatically wanted to take you to the next waypoint, which was often on an indirect line from where you were really supposed to go. So it's gotten a lot simpler in the old days, but the Suspend function is still there. And by manually taking yourself out of Suspend, you automatically will send it to the next appropriate point, but the toga button also does the same thing. The second area where you will see Suspend show up is when you continue that missed approach and you wind up getting to the missed approach point, which is often the last point in your flight plan, and often almost always ends in a hold. As soon as you enter that holding pattern, the navigator will automatically put you in Suspend. And depending upon what vintage of navigator you have, you may be able to not get out of Suspend at all until you put another waypoint into your flight plan, because oftentimes the missed approach hold point is the last point in a flight plan. Some of the newer navigators will allow you to do that, but that's again a topic of another subject. The next area where we see suspend is at the beginning of a lot of instrument approaches. Many approaches start off with the option of flying a course reversal, which is often depicted as a holding pattern. If you're coming from a direction that requires a procedure turn or course reversal, it's often done as a partial flying of that holding pattern around the horn once and then straight into the final approach course. When you first enter that holding pattern to start the course reversal, once again, the OBS button will switch to suspend. Why? It gives you the option so that if a controller or anybody else were to give you an instruction to say you have to remain in that holding pattern, the only way your approach would know that you have to do that is to activate that suspend button. The suspend button is there for your option to either turn on or turn off in that particular setting. And if you do turn it on, then you are going to stay in that holding pattern indefinitely until you turn it off. That's the opposite of what you get with the missed approach, where it automatically turns itself on, and in some navigators you can't turn it off, as I said before. And that would be utilized. You would automatically turn it on if you were told to stay in the holding pattern. It's that simple. So the option is there to have it on or off, but the option is there instead of having a suspend option. The last area where we see suspend is if you create, and this doesn't happen very often, but there's an option to create user-defined holds on any point along any navigation route in any part of the GPS database. If you create a user-defined hold because a controller or anybody else will tell you to randomly hold in some three-dimensional area of space, that suspend will also go on anytime you enter that holding pattern, and it will automatically turn itself on. So in that particular case, it works like a missed approach suspend function. So in review on that, suspend is mostly used when you're entering holding patterns, giving you the option to stay either in or out of a holding pattern after only one turn. The only other area where suspend automatically turns on routinely is at the missed approach point of an instrument approach. There's one other area where we see this being a problem with pilots, and that is if you use a function on an instrument approach that we all are familiar with called vectors to final. When you are using vectors to final, if you are not outside the final approach fix at the time the vectors to final option is chosen, the navigator gets fooled and thinks you've already progressed inside the final approach fix, so it will put you in suspend. It should automatically come out of suspend after you make that turnaround and come back inbound, but sometimes it doesn't, and so that's a potential trap. So if you look at this last picture I have over here, anytime we're in suspend mode, you can see that it not only says suspend down at the bottom of the screen in green, but it also in magenta says SUSP right smack on your HSI. That's a warning sign that something has happened that you may have to undo. And it's another reminder that you are in suspend in any of the modes. So it's a tool to keep you from going to the wrong place if you're not supposed to be going to the wrong place. And in that sense, it's very effective. But if it turns itself on when you're not expecting to turn itself on, you can often be fooled. And this is an area where avionics confusion often can come back to bite us. Suspend, as I said earlier, is only a function in Garmin navigators. In Avidyne navigators or other types of equipment, we don't need a suspend function at all. When we reach a missed approach point, there's a simple option, usually a soft key, that says, do you want to activate the missed approach? When that's the case, you just hit that. When you enter a holding pattern, it gives you the option to stay in the hold by having a soft key button that says stay in the hold. And when you want to exit the hold, there's another option that says exit the hold. It's a lot simpler. So suspend is a variant of a navigation difficulty that Garmin had trouble with when they first invented their navigators 30 years ago. We're stuck with it. There's nothing we can do about it. You get used to it when you've used it for a while. But the point of this discussion is to make sure you understand there's a marked difference between what Suspend does and what OBS does. So I'm Brian Turrisi. Thanks for watching and listening. I'll see you on the forums or hopefully at the next CPPP.